Hi everyone, and welcome to CIRA's online learning webinar for landlords. Again, we hope that these sessions will help you understand your AODA obligations, and we will also direct you to where you can learn more. This is the last of 4 webinars in a series. If you haven't listened to the first 3 modules, they can be accessed on our website at www.equalityrights.org under Information for Landlords at any time. In addition to these webinars, there is a comprehensive guide, and if you would like a copy of that guide, please visit our website, again, under the tab Information for Landlords. My name is Alyssa Brierly, and I'm CIRA's Executive Director and General Counsel, and I'm here today with Carly Bowie, Project Coordinator here at CIRA. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that these modules were made possible by funding through an Enabling Change Partnership project with the Government of Ontario, and we're grateful for their support. For those of you who are not familiar with CIRA, the Centre for Equality Rights in Accommodation, we were founded in 1987 as a province-wide, not-for-profit charity dedicated to promoting human rights and ending discrimination in housing. Our public education and outreach initiatives work to intervene in cycles of discrimination that disproportionately affect low-income and marginalized individuals in the housing market. Through public education, advocacy, and occasional test case litigation, CIRA works to address barriers that prevent individuals from accessing and maintaining housing. And before we start, a quick disclaimer. This webinar and the accompanying guide are intended to provide general information about your accessibility obligations. It is not legal advice, nor is it intended to substitute for legal advice. For information or questions about your specific situation, please consult a lawyer.
This module will cover frequently asked questions for housing providers regarding accessibility in housing under the Ontario Human Rights Code and the AODA. In Module 1, we covered the definition of disability, why accessibility is better for everyone, and the relevant laws in Ontario, and we began discussing the AODA and the IASR. In Module 2, we continued the IASR training, focusing on the information and communication standards and the design of public spaces. In Module 3, we discussed how to develop accessibility policies and plans. Throughout our month-long series, we hope that we conveyed that improved accessibility is better for everyone.
So our first question today is, what is discrimination? Discrimination is not defined in the Ontario Human Rights Code, but it usually includes the following elements: not individually assessing the unique merits, capacities, and circumstances of a person, and instead making stereotypical assumptions based on a person's presumed traits. This often leads to treating a person unfairly, denying them a benefit, excluding or imposing obligations, or disadvantage because of a particular characteristic or a perceived characteristic.
Our next question is, I didn't intend to discriminate, so is it still discrimination? Direct discrimination is what most people think of when they think of discrimination. Direct discrimination occurs when behaviors, actions, policies, or practices preclude a person with a disability from fully participating in society or fully enjoying a benefit. Indirect or adverse effect discrimination is often harder to identify and can happen even when someone is acting in good faith. This type of discrimination occurs when a seemingly neutral policy, rule, or practice disadvantages a member of a code-protected group, Even if unintentional, indirect discrimination is still discrimination under the code. Discrimination does not have to be intentional. A person can be found to have discriminated even if they did not mean to do so. An example of this is having a policy in the building where in order to put in a maintenance request, a renter has to fill out a form in writing and bring it to the superintendent's office. Even though seemingly it is treating everyone the same, this can have a discriminatory effect for persons living with disabilities who may not be able to fill out the form or go to the office without barriers. In this case, it would be advisable to have multiple ways to submit maintenance requests that meet varying needs of abilities.
Let's look at an example of discrimination that may not be obvious on the face of it. This is an example of what the Ontario Human Rights Code refers to as subtle discrimination. A renter requests an accessible parking spot close to the entrance of the building due to a mobility disability. You grant the request with the condition that the renter signs a new lease agreement before they can begin using the spot. This creates additional obligations on the renter with a disability that do not apply to other renters, and therefore it is discriminatory because the renter must take an additional step in the process in order to get the accommodation.
Our next question is about the relationship between the code and the AODA. The AODA and the Human Rights Code are different, but complementary pieces of legislation. The AODA requires organizations to identify, remove, and prevent barriers for persons living with disabilities. It includes requirements that all organizations must meet, with deadlines specific to an organization's type and size. The Ontario Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination against individuals based on 16 grounds, including disability and receipt of public assistance, which includes disability support payments. Under the code, housing providers have a legal duty to accommodate renters living with disabilities upon receiving requests to do so. Renters who are not accommodated may file a case before the Human Rights Tribunal for the discriminatory effects of living without that accommodation. If a housing provider meets all of their AODA requirements, they may still have obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code. However, meeting AODA obligations may result in fewer requests for accommodation if accessibility guidelines have already been met.
Our next question is, what is the difference between invisible and visible disabilities? Invisible disabilities may not be immediately noticeable. They can include mental health disabilities, brain injury, chronic pain, visual or auditory disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and learning disabilities. They are often referred to as non-evident. On the other hand, visible disabilities are most often physical disabilities for which the accommodation would typically be a physical alteration to the building or residential complex.
So our next question is, how might someone with a visible disability face barriers in the housing context? An example of a physical barrier is a curb outside the entrance of a building. This curb may prevent renters who use scooters or wheelchairs from entering the building safely. Heavy doors to enter and exit the building are another example. Renters who use mobility devices or have disabilities affecting their muscle strength may require an automatic door opener to safely enter and exit the building.
How might someone with an invisible disability face barriers in housing? An example of a barrier for individuals with invisible disabilities is the existence of inflexible customer service and communications policies. Renters living with certain types of invisible disabilities, such as visual impairment or mental illness, may experience challenges receiving building notices, remembering to pay their rent on time, or reporting issues to building management in line with standard building policy or practice. They may require alternative ways of completing these tasks.
Another question is, why should I prioritize accessibility? By 2031, over 6 million people in Ontario will either be living with a disability or be 55 years of age and over, accounting for 40% of all income. With the aging population, consumers are increasingly represented by the disability community. Accessibility should and must be prioritized. The ability of a renter to access services, programs, and facilities is vitally important to their well-being and dignity. Housing providers have a huge role to play in ensuring that Ontario is an inclusive and equitable place for everyone. The AODA sets the framework that allows housing providers to be intentional about their business and practices. Accessibility is better for everyone. It builds an inclusive environment and culture that ultimately benefits everyone. Ramps, for example, help people pushing strollers and delivering packages entering your building. Additionally, as an aging population, the need for accessibility is very prevalent. Ontario businesses need to market to and develop services for people with disabilities in order to compete and succeed. But beyond being good for business, it's just the right thing to do.
So you might be wondering if we have any tips for you to improve accessibility. And we do. So first, think carefully and creatively about what barriers may exist. Make a written list of all the known barriers and share it with your staff. Seek out solutions with your staff for removing these barriers. Implement policies that will ensure new barriers are not created. Always favor inclusion and integration when interacting with renters and addressing their issues and concerns. Don't forget to involve renters in the process. They have a lot of knowledge to share. And finally, focus on ensuring equality.
Our next question is about improving communications with renters with disabilities. To improve communication with people living with varying types of disabilities, it is important to provide information using different mediums, including writing documents in plain language, providing sign language interpreters, reading information out loud, providing written notices, text communications and emails, and using accessible PDF and Microsoft Word documents, for example. Moreover, all private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees are obligated to provide information in accessible formats or with communication supports. The accessible formats and communication supports must be provided as soon as possible and at no additional cost to the renter. Housing providers must consult with the renter who is requesting an accessible format or communication support to determine their accessibility needs. Both parties should work together to determine the most suitable format or communication support. An example of this is if a renter with vision loss requests that written correspondence from the housing provider be presented in an accessible format, they could decide together that the information will best be provided in an electronic file that is compatible with renter's text-to-speech computer program.
Our next question addresses how you can adapt your policies to better serve persons with disabilities. A good first step to adapting your policies is to understand what barriers exist in the ways that you currently deliver services and the various ways that renters need to access them. The policies should be consistent with the principles of dignity, independence, integration, and equality of opportunity. These policies must also clearly state that the housing provider will communicate with a person with a disability in a way that takes their disability into account. Additionally, the AODA stipulates that all private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must develop, implement, and maintain policies for providing goods, services, and facilities to persons with disabilities. Please note that these policies must address the issue of assistive devices, including, for example, oxygen tanks and walkers for renters. All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 50 or more employees must put their customer service policies in writing and make them available to the public when requested. Additionally, if requested, they are required to provide this document in an accessible format. As an example of a policy being adapted to better serve persons with disabilities, a renter with a cognitive disability may forget to pay their rent on time despite having the funds available to them to pay their rent on time. They have communicated to you that they would like to set up an automatic withdrawal for the first of the month so that they don't have fears of being evicted for not paying their rent on time. You tell them that they can't do that because a policy in the building doesn't allow for renters to pay their rent using this method. When adopting your customer service policies to provide greater accessibility, you should consider opening up all options for renters to pay their rent in a way that suits their particular needs.
Our next question is, what principles should I keep in mind when considering a request for accommodation from a renter under the code? So the first one would be dignity. It is important to provide service in a way that allows renters with disabilities to maintain their self-respect and dignity. This can be achieved by communicating with renters individually to understand their needs, understanding and contemplating the many ways that people need to access services, providing services in a way that ensures that the renter feels valued and deserving of full service. The next is independence. People living with disabilities most often wish to access services independently. This allows them to do things in their own way. Open communication will help housing providers discover how renters with disabilities wish to access and receive services. Next is integration. Renters with disabilities should be able to access services in a way that allows them to benefit from the same services in the same place and in a similar way as other renters. The goal should be to create an environment where housing providers' customer service policies and practices promote integration and full participation. Finally, equal or equitable opportunity for renters. Renters with disabilities should have the same opportunity to access services and at the same quality as others. They should not have to make significantly more effort or have to deal with more inconvenience than other renters.
Our next question asks, what are the responsibilities of the housing provider in the accommodation process under the Ontario Human Rights Code? Once a renter has made a request for accommodation to the housing provider, both parties must work together to find solutions. Both the housing provider and the renter have responsibilities in the accommodation process. Responsibilities of the housing provider include accepting the renter's request for accommodation in good faith, taking an active role in searching for accommodation solutions, maintaining confidentiality, granting accommodation requests in a timely manner, bearing the cost of any required medical documentation or information, and bearing the cost of accommodation up to the point of undue hardship.
On the same note, another question about the responsibilities of the renter in the accommodation process under the code. Responsibilities of the renter include advising the housing provider of the disability and to be clear about their accommodation needs, providing information regarding relevant restrictions and limitations, including providing medical documentation when appropriate, cooperating with experts whose assistance is needed when information is required that the renter cannot provide, and participating in discussions regarding possible accommodation solutions.
So with that aside, how is accommodation provided to a renter under the Ontario Human Rights Code? Housing providers are obliged to ensure that accommodations meet the unique needs of the individual requesting them. The Ontario Human Rights Code stipulates that a one-size-fits-all approach to accommodations is not sufficient. Individuals have unique needs, and the accommodation process should reflect this. It should promote integration and full participation of all renters. Accommodation is a shared responsibility. Housing providers and renters need to work together to determine and implement appropriate accommodations. And housing providers should talk to renters about their specific needs and work towards creative solutions.
Our next question is, what is undue hardship under the Ontario Human Rights Code? The Ontario Human Rights Code requires housing providers to accommodate renters with disabilities up to the point of undue hardship. In determining whether the point of undue hardship has been met, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal will consider the cost of accommodation, including access to outside sources of funding and any health and safety concerns that exist. To reach the point of undue hardship, a housing provider must demonstrate that making an accommodation would be so costly that it would affect the survival of their business or pose a health and safety risk that outweighs the benefit of accommodation. If cost is the issue, housing providers must also show that outside sources of funding are not available to assist them in covering the cost of the accommodation. In the event that the undue hardship threshold has been met, the housing provider still has a duty to find an interim or next best solution.
Do housing providers still have to accommodate renters under the Ontario Human Rights Code if they implement the AODA's requirements? And the short answer is yes. The duty to accommodate renters with disabilities is found in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Complying Complying with the AODA does not change a housing provider's responsibilities under the code. Housing providers must still respond to individual requests for accommodation should they receive any. If there is a conflict between the AODA and the Ontario Human Rights Code, the law that provides the higher level of accessibility must be followed.
Next question is, I am a smaller landlord. What resources are available to me? For financial assistance for accessibility, you may be able to receive assistance from the March of Dimes, and we've included their website and phone number here. For legal advice, please contact the Landlord Self-Help Center. For clarification on your obligations, please contact the AODA Help Desk.
At this point, are there any questions that anyone listening may have? Well, seeing none, we will sign off today. Once again, leaving you with a few resources to help you get more information about the AODA in the final few slides. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for joining us over the past 4 weeks to learn about your accessibility obligations under the AODA. We hope that this has been helpful and informative. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us here at CIRA through email at cira@equalityrights.org or by phone at 416-9